The Quarrel with History. Reading the paper The West Indian Writer and His Quarrel with History by Edward Baugh allows me to put forward the following observations. If it is ridiculous to claim that a people has no history, one can argue that, in certain contemporary situations, while one of the results of global expansion is the presence and the weight of an increasingly global historical consciousness, a people can have to confront the problem posed by this consciousness that it feels is vital, but that it is unable to bring to light. Because the lived circumstances of this daily reality do not form part of a continuum, which means that its relation with its surroundings, what we would call its nature, is in a discontinuous relation to its accumulation of experiences, what we would call its culture. In such a context, history, as far as it is a discipline and claims to clarify the reality lived by this people, will suffer from a serious epistemological deficiency. It will not know how to make the link. The problem faced by collective consciousness makes a creative approach necessary, in that the rigid demands made by the historical approach can constitute, if they are not restrained, a paralyzing handicap. Methodologies passively assimilated, far from reinforcing a global consciousness or permitting the historical process to be established beyond the ruptures experienced, will simply contribute to worsening the problem. The French Caribbean is the site of a history characterized by ruptures and that began with a brutal dislocation, the slave trade. Our historical consciousness could not be deposited gradually and continuously like sediment, as it were, as happened with those peoples who have frequently produced a totalitarian philosophy of history, for instance, European peoples, but came together in the context of shock, contradiction, painful negation, and explosive forces. This dislocation of the continuum, and the inability of the collective consciousness to absorb it all, characterize what I call a non-history. The negative effect of this non-history is therefore the erasing of the collective memory. When, in 1802, Colonel Delgrès blew himself up with his 300 men using the stock of gunpowder at Fort Matouba in Guadeloupe, so as not to surrender to 6,000 French soldiers who were encircling him, the noise of this explosion did not resound immediately in the consciousness of Martinicans and Guadeloupeans. It happened that Delgrès was defeated all over again by the sly trickery of the dominant ideology, which succeeded for a while in twisting the meaning of his heroic act and removing it from popular memory. Consequently, the French government's March 1848 proclamation to the slaves in Martinique asserted that Guadeloupeans had themselves demanded the reimposition of slavery in 1802. And when the Caribbean hero, Toussaint or Martí, was victorious, this was localized within their respective countries. The ideological blockade functioned just like the economic blockades against Haiti in the past and against Cuba in the present. If Bolivar found help and comfort in Haiti, if therefore for a while the notion of a common Caribbean history was real, this period was short-lived. Today, however, we are hearing the blast from Matouba. In order to repossess their historical space, the French Caribbean countries need to break through the dead tissue that colonial ideology has deposited along their borders. Therefore, because of their colonial origin, these peoples for a long time could only impose the latter, and especially in the Lesser Antilles, in sporadic bursts of a resistance that persisted, and not in the inexhaustible confrontation that the African countries, for example, could manage. The ancestral community of language, religion, government, traditional values, in brief a worldview, allowed these peoples, each in its own way, to offer continuous open resistance. The patience and the self-confidence created by such a cultural hinterland was not available to us for a long time. What resulted was that the French Caribbean people did not relate even a mythical chronology of this land to their knowledge of this country, and so nature and culture have not formed a dialectical whole that informs a people's consciousness. So much so that obscured history was often reduced for us to a chronology of natural events, retaining only their explosive emotional meanings. We would say the year of the great earthquake, or the year of the hurricane that flattened Monsieur Celeste's house, or the year of the fire on Main Street. And that is precisely the recourse open to any community without a collective consciousness and detached from an awareness of itself. No doubt the same chronology can be observed in peasant communities in certain industrialized countries. One cannot condemn this practice of a natural chronology as pure alienation, a study of the folk imagination, made fashionable because of the excesses of industrial and administrative dehumanization, demonstrates that the process is more rational than it was first thought to be. But nature, once severed from its meaning, is as impoverished, for man, and impotent as being subjected to history. The creative link between nature and culture is vital to the formation of a community. Today we hear the blast from Matuba, but also the volley of shots fired at Moncada. Our history comes to life with a stunning unexpectedness. The emergence of this common experience, broken in time, of this concealed parallel in histories, that shapes the Caribbean at this time, surprises us before we have even thought about this parallel. That means also that our history emerges at the edge of what we can tolerate. This emergence must be related immediately to the complicated web of events in our past. The past, to which we were subjected, which has not yet emerged as history for us, is, however, obsessively present. The duty of the writer is to explore this obsession, to show its relevance in a continuous fashion to the immediate present. This exploration is therefore related neither to a schematic chronology nor to a nostalgic lament. It leads to the identification of a painful notion of time and its full projection forward into the future, without the help of those plateaus in time from which the West has benefited, without the help of that collective density that is the primary value of an ancestral cultural heartland. This is what I call a prophetic vision of the past. History, with a capital H, ends where the histories of those peoples once reputed to be without history come together. History is a highly functional fantasy of the West, originating at precisely the time when it alone made the history of the world. If Hegel related African peoples to the ahistorical, Amerindian peoples to the prehistorical, in order to reserve history for European peoples exclusively, it appears that it is not because these African or American peoples have entered history that we can conclude today that such a hierarchical conception of the march of history is no longer relevant. Reality has, for example, forced Marxist thought to concede that it is not in the most technically advanced countries, nor in the most organized proletariat, that the revolution will first be successful. Marxism has thus used objective reality and its own viewpoint to criticize the concept of a linear and hierarchical history. It is this hierarchical process that we deny in our own emergent historical consciousness, in its ruptures, its sudden emergence, its resistance to exploration. Because the collective memory was too often wiped out, the Caribbean writer must dig deep into this memory, following the latent signs that he has picked up in the everyday world. Because the Caribbean consciousness was broken up by sterile barriers, the writer must be able to give expression to all those occasions when these barriers were partially broken. Because the Caribbean notion of time was fixed in the void of an imposed non-history, the writer must contribute to reconstituting its tormented chronology, that is, to reveal the creative energy of a dialectic re-established between nature and culture in the Caribbean. As far as we are concerned, history as a consciousness at work and history as lived experience are therefore not the business of historians exclusively. Literature for us will not be divided into genres, but will implicate all the perspectives of the human sciences. These inherited categories must not, in this matter, be an obstacle to a daring new methodology, where it responds to the needs of our situation. The quarrel with history is perhaps, for Derek Walcott, the affirmation of the urgency of a revaluation of the conventions of analytical thought. A reality that was long concealed from itself, and that took shape in some way along with the consciousness that the people had of it, has as much to do with the problematics of investigation as with a historical organization of things. It is this literary implication that orients the thrust of historical thought, from which none of us can claim to be exempt. Note 1. Concerning history as neurosis. Would it be ridiculous to consider our lived history as a steadily advancing neurosis? To see the slave trade as a traumatic shock, our relocation in the new land as a repressive phase, slavery as the period of latency, emancipation in 1848 as reactivation, our everyday fantasies as symptoms, and even our horror of returning to those things of the past as a possible manifestation of the neurotic's fear of his past? Would it not be useful and revealing to investigate such a parallel? What is repressed in our history persuades us, furthermore, that this is more than an intellectual game. Which psychiatrist could state the problematics of such a parallel? None. History has its dimension of the unexplorable, at the edge of which we wander, our eyes wide open. Note 2. Concerning transversality. However, our device histories in the Caribbean have produced today another revelation, that of the subterranean convergence. They, thereby, bring to light an unsuspected, because it is so obvious, dimension of human behavior, transversality. The implosion of Caribbean history, of the converging histories of our peoples, relieves us of the linear, hierarchical vision of a single history that would run its unique course. It is not this history that has roared around the edge of the Caribbean, but actually a question of the subterranean convergence of our histories. The depths are not only the abyss of neurosis, but primarily the site of multiple converging paths. The poet and historian Brathwaite, in his recapitulation in the magazine Savaku of the work done in the Caribbean on our history, our present day and obviously overlapping histories, summarizes the third and last section of his study with the single phrase, "The unity is submarine." To my mind, this expression can only evoke all those Africans weighed down with ball and chain and thrown overboard whenever a slave ship was pursued by enemy vessels and felt too weak to put up a fight. They sowed in the depths the seeds of an invisible presence. And so transversality, and not the universal transcendence of the sublime, has come to light. It took us a long time to learn this. We are the roots of a cross-cultural relationship. Submarine roots. That is, floating free, not fixed in one position in some primordial spot, but extending in all directions in our world through its network of branches. We, thereby, live. We have the good fortune of living this shared process of cultural mutation, this convergence that frees us from uniformity.